Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Data Playbook. We have the Sunday games completed now, so the last game to review will be the Monday night game, and that looks to be Kansas City at Jacksonville. So let's take a closer look. So, jumping right into our team panel, you have Kansas City that's favored on the money line with a spread of 3.5 points and a total line of 45.5 points. You have Kansas City with a passing rank of 4, a rushing rank of 9, an allowed passing rank of 21, and an allowed rushing rank of 30. For Jacksonville, you have a passing rank of 10, a rushing rank of 1, so they're the best in the league in running, an allowed passing rank of 30, and an allowed rushing rank of 13. Looking at our averages, Kansas City is just short of 235 passing yards per game and gets about 110 rushing yards per game. Jacksonville gets just over 211 passing yards per game and 144 rushing yards per game. Kansas City has had one interception this season and suffers on average 1.75 sacks per game. On Jacksonville's side, you average one interception a game, so they've had 4 total, and they suffer less than 1 sack per game. Defensively, Kansas City allows 194 passing yards per game and allows 127 rushing yards per game, while Jacksonville allows 246 passing yards per game and a little bit more than 82 rushing yards per game. Our QB hits are almost exactly the same, with 6 average per game for Kansas City and just short of 6 for Jacksonville. Defensively, Kansas City has had 3 interceptions, while Jacksonville averages over 2 interceptions per game. That comes out to 9 interceptions total this season, and they both average right about 2 defensive sacks per game. Looking at the quarterbacks, you have Patrick Mahomes for Kansas City and Trevor Lawrence for Jacksonville. Patrick Mahomes has had 88.6 fantasy points this season, averaging 22.1 per game. Trevor Lawrence has had 49 fantasy points this season, averaging 12.2 fantasy points per game. Mahomes has had 1 interception and suffered 7 sacks, while Trevor Lawrence has had 4 passing interceptions and suffered 3 sacks this season. So this comes out again where Mahomes has just less than 235 passing yards per game, and he gets about 32 rushing yards per game. Trevor Lawrence has 211 passing yards per game and averages about 8 rushing yards per game. Mahomes has had his best week last week with 270 passing yards, and his worst week in week 2 with 187. And other than his lowest week, he's managed to stay over 200 passing yards. Trevor Lawrence, also not too bad, but he has one other week, 174, and then 178 in week 1. Those were his 2 worst weeks. Otherwise, he's at 271 and 222 passing yards in the other 2 games. If we look into the running game with the running backs, you have Isaiah Pacheco on Kansas City, and you have Travis Etienne on Jacksonville. Isaiah has had 21.3 fantasy points, 27.3 in PPR, averaging 5.3 fantasy points, or 6.8 in PPR. While Travis has had 60 fantasy points, 66 in PPR. That's an average of 15.1 fantasy points per game, or 16.6 in PPR. Neither of these running backs have turned over the ball. For averages, you have Isaiah with almost 32 rushing yards per game and 6 receiving yards per game, while Travis gets just short of 100 rushing yards per game and 8 receiving yards per game. Week by week, Isaiah's had his best week in week 3 with 45 rushing yards, and his worst week in week 2 with 22 rushing yards. He has not been able to break 50 rushing yards here. Whereas Travis over here, his best week was week 1 with 143, but even last week he had 124 rushing yards, and his worst week was week 3 with 56. So Travis's worst week was better than Isaiah's best week. And given that Kansas City has one of the worst allowed rushing ranks, meaning they allow some of the most rushing yards in the league, and then you have Jacksonville as the best rushing team out there. So this could be an interesting combination. And then looking at the receivers, our number 1 receivers on each team are Xavier Worthy on Kansas City and Brian Thomas Jr. on Jacksonville. Xavier Worthy has 12.1 fantasy points this season, 17.1 in PPR, averaging 6 fantasy points per game, or 8.5 in PPR. He has played only 2 games, so keep that in mind. In fact, it looks like in his first game he's gotten no receiving yards, so he's only really had 1 game, it looks like. So there's really no averages, even though this first game will pull down that average. Brian Thomas Jr.'s fantasy points are 24, 36 with PPR. That's an average of 6 fantasy points, or 9 in PPR. Neither receiver has lost a fumble this season. And once again, looking at the averages, again with Worthy, since there was really only 1 week, we can see if the rushing. Yeah, so he had no rushing yards in the first game, no receiving yards in the first game. So the first game was really bunk for him, meaning that we don't need to look at the averages. It can just be he had 38 rushing yards in 3 carries, so that's interesting for a receiver. But otherwise, he had 83 receiving yards in that last game. That gives him kind of a small share, but he has missed a couple games, so that would be why. Brian Thomas also gets a couple carries, had 16 rushing yards total this season off of 2 carries. which is an average of 4 rushing yards per game. He also averages 41 receiving yards per game. And he has a full set of data where his worst week was week 1 with 11. His best week was week 3 with 55 receiving yards. And otherwise, he stayed right around that 50 mark. And in the end, that still gives him the largest share of receiving yards in the team. And finally, looking at the tight ends with Travis Kelce on the Chiefs and Britton Strange on the Jaguars. Kelce's had 24.2 fantasy points, 39.2 in PPR, averaging 6 fantasy points per game, or almost 10 in PPR. Britton Strange has had 18.2 fantasy points, 37.2 in PPR. That's an average of about 4.5 fantasy points per game, or 9.3 in PPR. Neither tight end has had any turnovers. Looking at their averages, they actually both have exactly the same receiving averages at 45.5 receiving yards per game. The way that breaks down is that you have Travis Kelce's best week in week 2 with 61 receiving yards, his worst week in week 3 with 26. Otherwise, he stayed right around that upper 40 range. With Britton Strange, you had his best week with week 3 with 61. His worst week was week 2 with 17. And otherwise, kind of same story, 59 and 45. And that gives both players about 12% of their share on both teams. So there you have it, the pregame review for Kansas City at Jacksonville for Monday Night Football. I hope that you got something out of it and you can make some smart choices. If you enjoyed, leave a like and subscribe, and leave a comment on what else you would like to see. But that's it for now. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.